Oh, hello and welcome everyone. Now, who doesn't love an exhilarating white knuckle ride on an XC bike down a hill? I know I certainly do. But sometimes it can get pretty wild, right? So I thought it was about time we brushed up on some downhill skills on our cross-country bikes. Right, let's kick this video off in a positive way, as we should always. Now, you don't have to be purely on an XC bike for these kind of points to be applicable. You can be on any bike, of course, as I said. And as always, don't forget, like and subscribe to the channel. And our memberships are now live as well, people. So if you fancy showing some love, that's a great way to do it. But we're gonna dive in with the dropper post. Now, not all of us have a dropper post on our cross-country bikes or our bikes in general, but for those of us that do, really want to make sure that thing is dropped every time you're going downhill. I all too often see in the bike parks people with it up, trying to go downhill, and they're really struggling. If your saddle is up really high, you're going to struggle to maneuver around on the bike, get your weight back properly. You'll actually see here in this clip, I was riding with it up, and my chest is literally resting on the saddle because of the height of it. And it's going to make life just much more difficult. There's a couple of reasons, though, that I do always see people with it up. First and foremost, people just kind of forget, and I get it, especially off the top of an uphill climb. You just drop straight in, you're like, oh no, fiddlesticks, I got to press the button. Ah, fiddlesticks, my dropper! And there you're trying to frantically press it. Another one's in a bit of a more intense situation. It might be a race or something like that, and you're just so focused and in the zone that actually, you know, when you're flat out redlining and you're suddenly hit with a descent, the last thing you almost think about sometimes is pushing the button and dropping that seat down as well. But regardless of the scenario, if you're pointing down, your seat should be down. Let's go, I love this section. Onwards! Ah, fiddlesticks, my dropper! Oh God. Stay alert, people. XC bikes, when going down, can be fickle, skittish beasts, which can throw you offline or off bike in a moment's notice. The key is to stay loosey-goosey, people. Yep, you want to stay nice and relaxed by tensing up and riding really tight. You're not really going to allow the bike to dance around and move underneath you, which is kind of what it naturally wants to do a lot of the time. In my eyes, manhandling an XC bike never goes particularly well either, especially if it's wet and slippery conditions. The aggressive riding position, slicker tyres and less suspension really don't like being forced into doing things that they don't want to do. It comes back to the mantra of staying loosey-goosey. Let the bike find the path of least resistance underneath you, and that's going to get you down, I think, in the most successful way possible. Let's talk about line choice now. Now, just because XC bikes have become more capable doesn't mean you can ride them or treat them or hit the same lines as what you could maybe on a trail bike or an enduro bike, certainly not a downhill bike. So this is a classic section for us here at the Forest of Dean. I've hit this many a time on on many bikes actually, but on an enduro bike, the line I would choose here is basically just plowing straight through the middle and dropping off onto the road at the end there, across all these big off-camber sort of matted routes. Now, when it comes to riding an XC bike, I can do the same line, as you'll see here. But it is slower, in my opinion, than actually choosing a slightly longer, smoother line like you can see here. So essentially, the difference is because obviously, you know, this line here, this main central line, is very chunky, it's dry at the moment, which thank goodness, because hitting it in the wet would almost be unrideable due to slicker tyres, less suspension. You know, you just have to potter through it, and when you're pottering through off-camber routes, it generally doesn't go through very well. What you can actually do is, without having to brake hard, you can carry speed around the top line. It sets you up still pretty nice for the drop onto the road, and it's generally going to be a bit safer as well. You've got to think about that actually. Hitting gnarly lines on XC bikes does have an inherent risk to it, either punctures, damaging wheels, bottoming out, not even being able to slow down enough, or you've got to slow down so much that actually it's not faster at all. Now remember, when you are choosing the right line to take, or hopefully the right line to take when you're riding downhill on your XC bike, there's a few things to think about. Now you've got risk versus reward, and you've got smoother or rougher line. So obviously, if I hammer through that maybe rougher line, they kind of go hand in hand a lot of the time. Am I going to do any damage? is it actually going to be faster? Or in the long run, because generally XC rides are also very long, you've got to think about fatigue as well. You know, it's all very good hammering through this bit as I would on an enduro bike with 170 mil of travel. But if you were to do this constantly on a smaller bike, maybe yes, it can be done a lot of the time, but it's flipping fatiguing, both on mind and body. All these things you want to kind of weigh up. I'd say a lot of the time, the faster line is often the smoother. Holy moly! Okay, this seems like a good point to talk about braking points. So how does braking change then when you're descending on a cross-country bike? Well, I've come to another old faithful section here, one that I must have hammered it through a gazillion times on an enduro bike. Now on an enduro bike, you'll have a little dab of the brakes at the beginning with to maybe scrub a touch of speed, and then you can go all the way through and brake kind of hard for the left-hander you can see at the very end. You can't do this as much on an XC bike. When you're going really hard, especially into a section where there's a sudden change in pace, you've got to remember that one, you haven't got the grip, so you can't brake really, really late and get the same traction. Your braking is going to have to be much more gradual. And there's another reason for this as well. XC brakes aren't as powerful as their enduro or downhill counterparts. Single pot brakes instead of 4-pot, and generally you're running smaller discs, maybe 160 front and rear or 180 at the front, 160 mil rotors. Because of this, you have to think that your braking points become slightly earlier, and you have to be a much more sort of gradual on those brakes. You can't just grab a handful and expect to slow down really quickly. Because of this kind of braking and not being able to just grab handfuls and slow down really quick, you've got to think about modulation as well. So kind of how hard you pull the brakes or how you feather those brakes, if you like. On steeper, turnier? Yeah, there's a word for you. On steeper, more technical sections like this, especially where it's a bit wet and damp, if you're really grabby on the brakes, you can cause, because of the slicker tyres, lock-ups on the front or the back end. Now remember, if you lock the back up, it's kind of controllable. If you lock the front up, especially in a muddy turn, sort of wet patch like this, that front end's gonna go. So you've really got to feather those brakes a little bit. Last but by no means least, this is kind of a more winter specific one. In the summer, I run organic pads in my brakes. Actually, I switch them out to sintered in the winter. It just gives a more consistent feel. They last a little bit longer as well and give sort of slightly better braking performance. Now let's talk about bike setup. Cross-country bikes obviously have to go up and down, so setting your bike up specifically for either one or the other is always going to be tricky. However, there are sort of some things that we can do to our bikes to make them favourable on the downhills, and those things are lockout. It goes without saying, if you're riding downhill, ideally you always want your suspension to be unlocked or in its softest position. That way you're going to have the most comfortable ride, you're going to absorb the most hits, and you're hopefully going to go the quickest. Now we'll talk about tyres, pressures, and kind of setup, if you like, front and rear here as well. So if you are favouring the downs, one, you might look at a ever so slightly thicker case tyre. So we've got the Vittoria Mezcals on here and an XC Race kind of casing and compound. They do an XC Trail as well, which is a slightly thicker version essentially. Same tread pattern, just slightly thicker. So if you find yourself sort of wanting that extra security, that is a route you could go down. But what I like to do actually really is to keep the same XC Race tyre, but I actually run an insert, so it kind of offsets that. I use the Vittoria Airliner on the inside of there, their XC Race one. And what that does is just, you know, it sort of negates the weight, if you like, but actually gives me that protection on impacts on the rim and pinch puncturing the tyre as well. Pressures wise, you might want to think about bumping it up a couple of PSI. My go-to kind of pressures on the XC bike are 21 PSI on the front, 23 PSI out back. Bar is on screen now. If it is a sort of much more downhill heavy ride, or certainly a downhill heavy loop, race, whatever that I'm doing, I may tend to go up a little bit there, unless the weather dictates it's really horrible and muddy, in which case I'll probably keep it the same. Well, there we go. Some top tips to hopefully get you descending better on your cross-country bikes, or any bike for that matter. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And don't forget, like and subscribe to the channels. And our memberships are now live as well. So don't forget, get on involved in the comments as well. We've got a couple of different tiers involved for you. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. And until next time, see ya.